There was once a beggar who lived in a grand city that was located deep in the heart of a poor country. His name was Clarence. There he spent every day on the streets with his hands reaching out for any coin or morsel that anyone could spare. Though he had spent many years as a beggar, he spent most nights starving on the pavement in a dark alley. On one particular morning close to the winter solstice, Clarence awoke to his belly gurgling intensely. He got up from his corner, grabbed his crumpled hat, and set off to his favorite spot. Instead of hoiling up near the market like the other beggars, he liked to sit next to a bank a few blocks off. There were many wealthy men who passed through and spared him a coin or two, but the best part was how there were rarely any competition. At least until last year. He had never seen this other beggar before, but he didn't impede his ability to gain coin, so it didn't bother Clarence much. When he arrived at the front of the bank, he noticed that there were fewer people than usual. He figured it was from the bitter cold of the morning and believed that once daylight crept over the roofs of the buildings and homes, more people would make their way there. The sun eventually rose over the town, but hardly any people passed through, let alone looked at him. By the time twilight made its way through the sky, Clarence was left with nothing. He was already famished from the morning, and the thought of having to go through another night hungry almost brought him to tears. As he sat there slumped over on the cold street, he noticed someone making their way towards him. It was the other beggar, who was carrying with him a chunk of stale bread. He sat down next to Clarence, and without saying a word, tore the bread in half. The other beggar handed him one of the halves, in which they ate together before he departed for the night. As Clarence gathered his things, he thought that if he were in that position, he would have kept it for himself. He knew that it wasn't enough for the both of them, as he felt his stomach grumble still. As he was making his way back to his alley, he noticed that he didn't see anyone else with him on the streets. He then realized that the street he was on was unfamiliar, even though he had taken the same route that he had for years. He tried to find his way, took many different paths, and even backtracked, but no matter what he tried, he was lost. Tired, frustrated, and hungry, the beggar decided to enter a nearby alley to rest for the night before trying to find his way back the next day. When Clarence entered the alley, he noticed something strange. Someone had left their door slightly open, and a bright yellow light poured out, followed by something that smelled heavenly. Clarence peered into the crack, where he beheld a beautiful sight. A gorgeous, decorated room that had a table in the center filled with all sorts of lavish and delicious-looking foods. He stepped inside and scanned across the room to see if anyone was around to claim the feast. He saw no one, so he redirected his gaze back to the wonderful display. His stomach grumbled horribly, and against his better judgment, he grabbed the closest piece of food and stuffed it into his mouth. He ate and he ate until he was full. Then he turned around and made a swift exit. He quickly made his way to another alley a block away and lay down on his back. He didn't care that he was freezing and away from his home, as this was the first time he had gone to bed full. He could feel his eyelids grow heavy, and before long he began to dream. In this dream, Clarence was no beggar, but a king in a vast and wealthy kingdom. Even though he had everything he could possibly imagine, what gave him the most satisfaction was touring through his lands to receive the praise of his people. On one particular sunny day, he decided that he wanted to go out into the beautiful countryside where one could find a small, cozy village. During his trip, he rode across green rolling hills and a pristine crystal clear stream. The village was located just outside where the plains meet an evergreen pine forest. As he came close to his destination, he saw that the village folks were waiting for him at the edge of the village, next to a barn. He got out of his carriage while the people cheered for his arrival. They showered him with gifts and affection, but he wasn't feeling overjoyed as he had expected. Instead, he only felt dread. He couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was watching him, judging him, salivating. He scanned through the crowd, their cheers grow muffled, as he looked desperately to find what was making him feel this way. He looked and looked until his instinct told him to look to his left. As he turned his head in the direction of the barn, he finally noticed it. A pig, not any ordinary pig, but a disgusting foul creature. Its body was heavily bloated, but its skin sagged as if it were loose. Its black, beady eyes stared into his soul, and Clarence felt as if the world began to stretch and time was slowing down. Though the world did not move, the pig seemed as if it were coming towards him. Clarence began to panic and tried to run, but his body would not listen. As the creature came closer and closer, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest, ready to burst out of his ribs. The pig had gotten so close that he could feel its hot breath on his skin, until he suddenly jolted awake from the cold floor of the alley. The light of the morning was making its way towards him, and he let out a sigh of relief as he realized it was just a dream. The dream initially troubled him, but the thought had quickly passed as he chalked up to his belly and the feast that he had the night before. His stomach grumbled once more, so he decided that he would try to find his way back to the bank. He looked around in order to find his bearings, but quickly noticed something odd. He wasn't in the same alley that he thought he stumbled into last night, but instead, he found himself back at his home. He thought maybe because he was so hungry and it was a particularly dark night that he simply became disoriented. There were no reasons to mule over it, and he should continue with his day as he normally did. Clarence grabbed his hat, got up, and set out to his usual spot. When he had gotten there, everything seemed normal. The other beggar had his spot across the street, and unlike yesterday, there were many people out and about with pockets filled with coin. As the day passed, Clarence hadn't received much, but he had just enough to get himself a simple meal. He was going to be able to eat today, but he couldn't help but think about the feast he had yesterday. Getting a meal so small as today wasn't enough anymore. He wanted that delicious banquet, and he wanted to fill his belly until it burst. Clarence decided that he was going to find that place again. He quickly grabbed his things and turned to retrace his steps when he just so happened to look over at the other beggar. Clarence noticed that this other beggar wasn't as fortunate as him, as he didn't have a single coin in his possession. For a second, he thought he should bring him to find the banquet together, but he quickly shut it down. If Clarence brought this beggar along with him, he might tell the others about it, and if too many people show up, then there won't be enough for Clarence to eat. He turned his focus away from this beggar and began his way to find the alley. It didn't take him too long once it had gone dark, as the light from the door shone out into the street. Like a moth to a flame, he quickly made his way towards the door. Just like last time, he poked his head inside, but this time, he was met with a room that stretched far beyond what he could see and filled with golden light. The table at its center stretched just as far as the room, and every inch of it was filled with the most delicious looking food that one could imagine, as if it had stepped out of the mortal world and through the pearly gates of heaven. Without hesitation, he rushed to the table and began to stuff his mouth with whatever he could grab. He ate and he ate until it was too painful to move, and even then, he was simply waiting until he could stuff more into his gullet. At some point, after eating so much of this food, he could feel his eyes grow heavy. He tried to get up and leave, but his belly was too full and his eyes were ready to give in. Eventually, his eyes closed and he began to drift into sleep. Clarence found himself back in his kingdom, but everything seemed off. He was not inside his castle walls, but was instead standing in the center of the village near the pine forest. The sky was gray and the ground muddy as if it had just rained. Periodically in the distance he could hear the faint sound of thunder and a few flashes of lightning following. He wandered around trying to find anyone, a single living soul, but there was no one to be found. As he made his way through the village, he realized that he was coming up on the barn. He instantly froze, remembering the experience he had the last time he was there. Instead of facing that dreadful pig, he quickly turned around to look elsewhere for a sign of life. He got to the corner of one of the buildings and made a turn, only to find the barn in front of him. He panicked and turned around to get away, but immediately saw it again in the distance. No matter which direction he turned or how far he went, he would always come face to face with that barn. Unsure of where else he could go, he mustered up the courage and made his way down the road where it led to that building. He dared not look in its direction as he drew closer, too scared to look at the pig eye to eye. Then the idea that the pig would creep up on him terrified him enough that he couldn't help but look. As his eyes darted in the direction of the barn, he felt a wave of relief as there was no sign of the pig. He chuckled to himself about being afraid of some prey animal that could do no harm when he suddenly felt his spine chill. There was something in front of him. He slowly turned his head towards the road and his heart dropped. The pig stood in front of him, looking even more grotesque than before. The skin on its face looked as if being pulled tight against its skull, with its eyes bulging from its sockets. Its body was covered in sores and boils, which gave off a foul smell of death and decay. Clarence tried to flee, but again he was frozen in place. The world around him began to stretch, and he could feel himself starting to slowly sink into the mud beneath him. He tried to scream for help, but the only thing that came out of his mouth was a faint whimper. He struggled and screamed at his body to move, but it was all in vain as he began to sink deeper and deeper into the mud. His heart was racing, and he was reaching his breaking point when he felt his eyes jolt open into the dark night back in the alley. He released a sigh of relief once he realized it was just a nightmare, except that his legs felt like they were stuck in the mud, just like it had been in his dream. He looked down to see what it was, only to see something that looked like a swollen tube with 2 holes at the end. He then felt something starting to yank him closer, and that was when he figured it wasn't a tube, but it was a snout of a giant pig. He screamed in terror as he realized he was inside its mouth. He grabbed onto a nearby pole and tried to pull himself out. As he struggled to get away, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he was able to make out the features of the creature. It looked exactly the same as the pig in his nightmare, except it was large enough to swallow a man whole. He began to beat on the creature in hopes that it would let him go, but only dragged him further in. He grabbed onto the nose, and it seemed to work as he stopped moving. However, he felt the head of the pig begin to shift as it started to open its jaws wide. Clarence felt his fingers begin to slip and instinctively looked down into the animal's gaping maw, where he saw what was pulling him in. There, inside the pig's mouth, was a pair of long, shriveled arms jutting out of the throat of the beast, with its decrepit, spindly hands grabbing onto his body. Deep in the darkness, he saw a devilish grin and a haunting pair of eyes staring at him. There were no emotions in those eyes, only an insatiable hunger. It pulled at him hard, and his fingers finally gave out. Clarence slid deeper into the pig's mouth as its jaws began to slowly close. He clawed at its wet flesh as a final attempt at escape, but there was nothing that he could latch onto. In his final moments, he looked out into the street, out in the cold, crisp night, as the jaws of the pig closed shut. Thank you guys for listening in to this original horror story called The Prize Pig. This was actually a sneak peek of what my comic was going to be like, the one that I mentioned in the very first video I made for this channel. If you guys have seen that introduction and knew about what the story was going to be about, maybe you've already figured out what this story represents. Hint, hint, it's about the 7 deadly sins. I want to give thanks to my husband who gave me this idea that I should do like a horror short story for the spooky season, but also give like a tiny tidbit of what my comic was going to be like. And I thought this was such an awesome idea to do. Speaking of my husband, I want to give him a huge thank you for helping me make this project come true. He did the story part of this video and I did all the art. I did like write down the story plot, like I wrote the short story, but he came in and made it better. Basically, he made it more descriptive and I guess more horror-like. Without him, like this video would have been delayed past Halloween, like probably even days or weeks, and I was dreading for that to not happen because this is meant for Halloween and I wanted to be released on the holiday. He also had to juggle between school and doing this video for me, and so it's like I felt really bad that he had to do that, but at the same time I was so grateful that he was willing to help me out despite having school in his schedule. So I love him so much for it. But yeah, with this type of video where I just read a short story and then draw out scenes that happen in the story, I always wanted to try doing it because it seemed really fun to do and I love reading stories. Obviously doing this was an awesome idea to do anyway. If you guys would like to see more videos like this, it doesn't have to be horror. I mean, it can be just like anything really, like love stories, comedies, dramas, like anything. Do let me know down in the comments and I will see all your guys' suggestions. But with that, I hope you guys have a happy Halloween. Definitely be safe for tonight. If you are going trick-or-treating, make sure you fill up your bags with yummy candies and hopefully not anything other than that, you know. But obviously stay safe, like don't get into trouble. But if you are just gonna stay home, I hope you have like a cozy night watching scary movies or scary TV shows and just have the most comforting yet spooky, scary night of Halloween. I hope you guys have a wonderful night and happy Halloween. Bye bye.